Welcome back. In this video, we're going to look at business-related meals, entertainment, and home office expenses. As a reminder, for tax years 2018 through 2025, employees are not allowed to deduct their unreimbursed employee expenses. So these expenses, to the extent they are deductible, are only going to be deductible by businesses. So we're going to talk about these expenses in the context of a self-employed individual. So let's start with expenses for meals. So imagine that you have an important client and you take your client out to dinner. You discuss business, but the meal also probably has some element of personal pleasure. Should this expense be deductible for tax? And if it is, wouldn't it be great to go to the best restaurants with your clients and get a nice big deduction for your nice big meal? Well, Congress recognized that meals contain an element of personal pleasure for the taxpayer and his or her employees, but the meal is still related to the business. So to strike a balance between the two, Congress decided to make meals, in general, 50% deductible. In other words, only half of the bill for dinner with your client would be deductible for tax. However, the cost of transportation to and from a business meal, like an Uber ride, would still be 100% deductible. An additional requirement for getting a 50% deduction is that the meal cannot be lavish or extravagant under the circumstances. This doesn't mean that expensive steak dinners and fine wines can never be deductible. It just means that the expenditure, once you take into account facts and circumstances, has to make sense. So, for example, taking out a client who generates significant revenue for your business to a fancy steakhouse is probably pretty reasonable. Another requirement is that the taxpayer or the employee of the taxpayer must be present at the meal. So you can't just give your client a credit card and tell him to have a nice dinner. And of course, a business meal can be deductible even without a client present. For example, if you or one of your employees are traveling, those meals would still be deductible at 50%. The next business expense we'll talk about is for entertainment expenses. So prior to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, entertainment expenses were, like meals, 50% deductible. But as a result of the TCJA, starting in 2018, entertainment expenses are now completely non-deductible. And this is a permanent change, meaning it's not scheduled to sunset or expire in the future. So what are some examples of non-deductible entertainment expenses? Well, dues paid to a country club or a social club are not deductible. In fact, these types of dues weren't even deductible prior to the recent tax law change. And you can contrast this with professional dues, that is, dues paid to a trade or business organization, which are generally 100% deductible unless a part of that due is related to lobbying, which we talked about in a previous video. Also, tickets to sporting events, concerts, shows, etc. are going to be non-deductible now. So even if you're taking a client to a show and discussing business before and after the show, the cost of the tickets are non-deductible because it is entertainment. Likewise, amounts paid to golf with a client would be non-deductible. And the list goes on and on. So now, any activity of a type generally considered to constitute entertainment, amusement, or recreation is non-deductible. But, like always, there are a few exceptions. One exception is for expenses for recreational and social activities primarily for the benefit of your employees. In those cases, the meals and entertainment associated with the event would be 100% deductible. And examples here would be the occasional office team building dinner or maybe an annual office holiday party. Now, let's turn to expenses related to having an office in the taxpayer's home. Again, during the current period from 2018 to 2025, these expenses would only be deductible for self-employed individuals. So, how does a self-employed individual get a deduction? In general, for a portion of the cost of a home office to be deductible, the office must be used exclusively and on a regular basis as the principal place of business or place of business used by customers. A principal place of business is where the taxpayer conducts administrative and management activities, and there is no other fixed location where the taxpayer conducts the activity. And because of the potential abuse for taking deductions related to a taxpayer's home, Congress placed a few extra limitations on what a taxpayer can deduct. First, home office expenses are limited to the gross income generated in the business activity minus the expenses unrelated to the use of the home. This means that the taxpayer has to take the gross income from the business activity and subtract out any non-home related expenses. If this net income is positive, then the taxpayer would be eligible for the home office deduction, but they can only deduct as much as there is in net income left. If the home office expenses exceed net business income, then these are disallowed in the current year and carried forward indefinitely and can be deducted in future years, but subject to the same limitations. So once a taxpayer knows how much they can deduct in the current year, their home office expenses are deductible in 3 tiers. And you keep moving down the tiers until you exhaust your allowable deduction amount, and then the remainder, if any, becomes the carry forward. First, the taxpayer will deduct expenses related to the home that would otherwise be deductible even if the home office wasn't there. For example, property taxes and home mortgage interest. But instead of these expenses being deducted on Schedule A as an itemized deduction, they would be deductible on Schedule C as a 4 AGI deduction. Second, the taxpayer would deduct other operating expenses like utilities, phones, internet, security, lawn care, home maintenance, and insurance. And then in the third and final tier, a taxpayer would be able to take depreciation deductions related to the home office portion of the home. Of course, just because you have home office doesn't mean you can deduct all of your home expenses. Instead, the deductible amount of any expense is going to be prorated between the portion of your home used for business and the portion of the home that you live in. So, for example, if 20% of the square footage of your home is being used by the home office, then 20% of your home mortgage interest, property taxes, home maintenance, heating, utilities, etc. would be deductible as the home office expense. Alternatively, if keeping track of and allocating actual expenses is too cumbersome, there is an optional simplified method where you can just multiply your home office square footage by a set dollar amount. But this usually results in a smaller deduction than the actual expenses.